professor. And Professor S. N. Negade, he is our mentor and former Vice Chancellor of the University of Mysore. Professor S. R. Niranjana, former Vice Chancellor of Gulbarga University. And all others who are all present online. Today we are conducting a webinar, the State of India, a critic. So this topic is which is really required during these COVID days. So Professor V.K. Nataraj is going to deliver the lecture of this webinar. I welcome Professor V.K. Nataraj on behalf of University. And also I welcome Professor S. N. Negade, whose great presence is always the strength to us. And also I welcome Professor S. R. Niranjan and also our registrar R. Shivappa. So this webinar, let it go. The deliberations of this will be useful to all of us. And there are many participants online. So really we wanted to hear V.K. Nataraj. His way of speaking and also understanding is totally different. After a long time I'm hearing, definitely you will also enjoy this. I wish all the participants all the best. Thank you very much.
So I welcome Honorable Vice Chancellor for this webinar. As a coordinator of this program, before taking up this topic, we were thinking, and also I discussed with Professor Ranganath, is instrumental in this organizing this webinar, and he only insisted me to arrange this webinar with Professor Nataraj, because we know many of the new generation, they may not be knowing Professor Nataraj, a contribution and he worked. I think it is 20 years it passed. In the last 2 decades back, he was very running hours in the university, and we are all juniors by that time. And he was a registrar of the Mysore University. He served as a registrar, and he contributed a lot. Even now, God has given good health for him to speak for us, and we can get a lot of knowledge out of his lecture. And the idea of this, the state of the state in India, I could not understand this title, and a critic in the beginning. I discussed with Ranganath, then only Nataraj can tell what is this topic, then complete information is given. That today's situation, we were thinking that the idea of this webinar is how to revive the economy and education at this COVID situation in the country as well as the world. So that is important now. So because research, teaching, and students' communication, everything is declined. Whatever we are making on online, so that is not effective, in my opinion, as face-to-face teaching. So in that way, last 8, 9, 10 months, we don't have communication with the students and the economy, especially. Economy has gone down. Now the government is telling that every day you see in the TV, there is no money for any program, any scheme. Government is not able to give the even stipend and some of the schemes, they have given the money, they have stopped it. So in this situation, economy has completely gone down in the country. And also the education, also very pathetic situation. We are seeing last 1 month that they are going to start the classes, and then they wanted to close the classes. Now there is no education for primary, high school and PU. Only we are going to start a degree and master degree. All these things, why it is happening, how to revive. So that's we are expecting from his lecture. I don't know what he is prepared, but title itself is telling that it is a little bit for us. I have a curiosity to listen him what he is going to speak on the state of the state in India. As coordinator, I welcome once again Honorable Vice Chancellor and Professor Hegde sir. I requested him to join with us, and he also joined very happily. And our Honorable Registrar is here. And I once again, on behalf of the university and all of you who are logged in for this program, I welcome Professor Nataraj to take the dais on the thing. So thank you very much.
It's fine, sir.
All set?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Vice Chancellor, my esteemed friend, Professor Hegde, my young friend, Professor Niranjana, He still looks very young, and he was very young when I first met him. And my other young friend, Professor Shivappa, and all other friends. I am very grateful to the Vice Chancellor, to Professor Niranjana, and Professor H.A. Ranganath for giving me this honor of addressing a university audience.
Can you hear?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Is it, am I audible? Okay.
Very much.
Okay, thank you. So I'm very grateful to the Vice Chancellor, Professor Niranjana, Professor Ranganath, for giving me this honor of coming back to the university after 20 years of retired life. I have come here now and then, but this is an honor. Now, let me just give a little information on what I mean by this title so that Professor Niranjan will have no complaints against me. What I wanted to suggest was, I want to know what the state is doing now. In other words, what is the situation of the state? I'm using the word state in two different senses. One is in Kannada, we say sthiti. State is also sthiti. State is also, state ಅನ್ನೋದು ಸರಿಯಾದ ಪದ ಇಲ್ಲ ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ. ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಅಂತಾರೆ, ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಅಲ್ಲ, it is different. Anyway, that's the sense in which I'm using it. So what I propose to do is that I don't want to take too long, because when you are speaking to an unseen audience, it's always better to be on the brief side. It is not when it's different when you are talking to people who are sitting here. No, that's all. They can have
certain response.
Some response, most certainly.
Now,
Now, I want to begin by saying that there are certain interesting phases in the way in which the state has conducted itself in India from independence. And the state has certain obvious functions like maintaining law and order and so on. I don't want to go into those very obvious matters. We all know them. First of all, at the time of independence and when planning started, we had the feeling that certain exclusive functions must be assigned to the state. One of the functions was to plan for social and economic development so that your overall welfare levels will go up. I'm putting it in very lay language for deliberate reasons. So from the 1950s, particularly in the mid-1950s, when the second five-year plan started, the state was assigned a very important role, that for certain important activities such as development of industries, especially basic and heavy industries, the state alone should be responsible. Secondly, the state alone has to be responsible, or at least should be very largely responsible for improving the welfare levels of the population. And among the welfare activities, the two which are most important, of course, are education, medical, and health services. These are the most important. There are others, but these are the most basic things. For example, today, if you look at the Human Development Index, which is prepared by the UNDP, there also they talk about longevity, they talk about minimum income, and they talk about education, health services, etc. So at that time, it was thought that certain functions should belong exclusively to the state, and the state had what I call a very strong interventionist role. This went on during the second plan, during the third plan, and a little later. But then, as usual, we had problems. One of the major problems, of course, was food shortage in the 1960s, which was solved only after the introduction of the Green Revolution, which most of you would be familiar with. And there are here experts in botany, zoology, and biotechnology who know it much better. So at that time, planning took a slight backseat. It was not possible to continue planning with the same rigor as, for example, in the 1950s and the early 1960s. But some kind of planning did go on, but we had a planning holiday between 1969 and 1974. There was a plan holiday. I'm just mentioning this to illustrate how the functions of the state or the strength of the state has got slightly diluted over time. At one time, it had a very strong interventionist role. Then, because of various reasons like food shortage, etc., it began to wane slightly, like the waning phase of the moon. Now, let us skip a few years. I can't trace every bit of it because we don't have enough time. The next stage was when there was a concerted effort to impose some restrictions on the state. In other words, there was a feeling that the state has not been successful in all the interventions in which it has taken part. For example, in terms of economics, in terms of development of industries, in terms of development of agriculture, its record is not all that impressive. That's the feeling you got in the 1980s. Now, one other factor which has to be added to this is this. In the 1980s, a new philosophy of economics began to get popularized. It was called the new political economy. Now, one of the important issues in new political economy is that the state basically is not a very efficient organ. It is not particularly efficient in developing industries. It's not particularly efficient in encouraging economic growth. And therefore, the theory was that most of these activities should be handed over to the private sector. And the state only has a certain supervisory role, if you like. It merely supervises. It does not take active interest in all these matters. In other words, new political economy was a doctrine which believed essentially in a free market. Now, I am mentioning it because today we talk about the free market quite a lot in India. We talk about free market, we talk about one nation, one market, and look at some of the bills which have been passed, all of which actually take away powers from the state and hand it over to the private sector. I'll come to that later. So in the 1980s, at the global level, this new political economy was a very important doctrine. Today, people don't talk about it for a variety of reasons, but in the 1980s, there was a lot of literature on this. As I said, the principal factor there was that the state is not particularly efficient, and the functions of the state must be handed over to the market, and the free market would be in a much better position to discharge these responsibilities, including economic growth, and to a certain extent, even social security. Now, this is one aspect. The second is that in India, as a result of the participation of the government or the state in a very strong way in economic matters, one unfortunate result came to the fore. That result was that there were too many regulations. As a result, there was corruption, because when you have too many regulations, you also find methods of bypassing those regulations. And one way of bypassing it is through not very legal, not very ethical means that we all know what a role corruption plays in this country. This is what prompted Rajaji, Chakravarti Rajgopalachari, to say, what we have in India is not a planned economy. What we have is a license permit Raj. For everything you need a license, for everything you need a permit. You want to start a school? Well, apply for a license. You want something else, you want to start an industry? Ask for a license. Along with this license and permit Raj, there also came, as I said, a great deal of corruption. And of course, when you have bureaucratization of any process, I mean, most of us are university people here. We also know how things get stuck in the university mainly because of bureaucratization. Here is Professor Hegde, who was Vice Chancellor when I retired, he knows.
Who wanted to demolish it, but failed.
You can't. I mean, it's difficult. But jokes apart, this license permit Raj also meant that there was a lot of scope for corruption. And it led to what in economics we call a rent-seeking state. A rent-seeking state is one where a person or an institution, makes gains, not through productive activity like manufacturing, but through this kind of manipulation. I'm putting it in very non-technical terms. So please don't quote me to an economist. An economist will say that this definition is wrong. It doesn't matter. It conveys what I have in mind, that you are actually making money not because you are producing something, but you're doing it because I'm an intermediary. I'm helping you to get a license. I'm helping him to get a permit. I'm getting them to do something else. So this was again a charge against the state, that it is leading to rent-seeking activity. It's leading to corruption. There is inefficiency, as a result of which resources are not properly allocated. So this new political economy came as an important foundation for the criticism against the state. Then along with that, what happened, there was also a feeling that the present at that time, when I say present, I'm talking about the late 1970s, 1980s, what have you done for the environment? You must understand that in those days, the environment was not such an important field. I don't think any university had a course in environmental science. Nobody had. In fact, in Mysore, the Institute of Development Studies was one of the very first, perhaps in the whole state, to have a course in environmental planning. We ran a postgraduate diploma in environmental planning, but that was an exception. So they said, look at this development. You are giving no attention to the environment. What happens to environment? What is going to happen to your resources? All your resources are not inexhaustible. Someday your resources are going to get exhausted. Then the other thing is, this pattern of development, which was found then, is not sufficiently or adequately attentive to human rights. You're talking about growth, but what about human rights, human development? That's how, in fact, the Human Development Index came. You know, the Human Development Index is prepared by the United Nations Development Planning, UNDP. And originally, interestingly, it was designed by a combination of an Indian and a Pakistani economist. One is our own Amartya Sen, Nobel laureate, and the other was Mahbubul Haq, who was a very fine, outstanding Pakistani economist. They came out with this Human Development Index to say that when you talk about development, you have to give more than adequate attention to what you call human development, the human aspects of development. As a result of all this, there was a concerted attack against the state, that the state, in fact, is a fairly inefficient organization. Now, this new political economy, which I referred to, went too far. It had a very cynical view of politics. It had a very cynical view of the state. Much of it was very highly, grossly exaggerated, but it was there. Now, one result of that was that the importance of the state started to decline. That was natural. And there were, of course, political lobbies which also said, give everything to us, to the free market, we will run it. One other factor, in the late 1970s, capitalism. I don't want to mention names, but it's all right, this is an academic discussion. Some very fine economists have pointed out that unlike, let us say, the Birlas or the Tatas, who were there even before independence, and who had a certain concern for society, this new aggressive capitalism was interested only in increasing its profits, not really interested in what happened to society. And they mentioned the Ambanis as one example of predatory capital. We all know it's a remarkable story how the original Ambani came up. Let's not go into that. So there was a constellation of circumstances which reduced the importance of the state. One, as I said, the state's own inefficiency, this license permit raj, too many regulations, and of course, lack of attention to several factors. plus other internal factors like this growth of aggressive capitalism. Then a few other things happen. But you also have to understand two other important factors. We tend to lose sight of them. One interesting factor is that in the 1980s, certain regulations which were there earlier on in the Indian economic framework started to get loosened. In other words, what we call economic reforms, I'm sure all of you, even non-economists, are familiar with this expression, economic reforms, which started in 1991. But even prior to 1991, a certain loosening of the economic structure had begun to take place. And a British author by name Robert Jenkins has used a beautiful phrase to describe this. He says, these were reforms by stealth. You did not say, I am going in for reform, but I introduced the reforms in a very subtle way. Like very often we have done it. I know the sitting vice chancellors here, two former vice chancellors are there, and I'm a former registrar, and our registrar is here. There are times when you do something very subtly so that you don't have a massive opposition from students or whatever. So in the same way, in regard to economic policy, some loosening of this framework began to take place in the mid-1980s. The importance of which was realized only much later, and this is what Robert Jenkins has referred to as reforms by stealth. Very subtly, you relax regulations somewhere. You realize it only a year later, saying, oh, this has happened. So that was one. But by the end of the 1980s, the situation was somewhat chaotic. At that time, it is said that India had enough foreign exchange only to pay for 2 weeks of imports. And therefore, the government decided we are going to approach international organizations for funding, external assistance, so that we can tide over this problem. As usual, there are two sides to it. There is a school of thought which believes that we could have managed without going to the IMF with a begging bowl, and as a result, agreeing to their conditionalities. But that is in the past. Maybe they were right, maybe they were wrong. Anyway, government decided at that time, when P.V. Narasimha Rao had just taken over as Prime Minister, and when he appointed Dr. Manmohan Singh as his Finance Minister. But I'm giving you this background because generally we think that one fine morning Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh got up and over their morning cup of tea decided, let's have reforms from tomorrow. No change ever takes place that suddenly. It's impossible. Even in your personal lives, change does not take place that suddenly. And certainly not that radically, that suddenly. There's a history behind it. But they decided that we are going to make this formal. We are actually going to say we are adopting what is called, at that time, it was called Structural Adjustment Program, which meant that certain conditions which were imposed by the International Monetary Fund had to be followed by us. I don't want to go into the details. One, of course, was reduction in the levels of direct taxation. That's one. But really, in a fundamental sense, what the reform meant was that the, how should I say, that the scope of the state had to be narrow. The amount of territory which was yielded to the state had to be narrow. In other words, to put it in one short expression, dilution of the state's role. That officially started in the 1990s. So from 1990-91, you find that the role of the state has been diluted. So you had reforms by stealth. Secondly, you had reforms by adoption. We adopted reforms and openly said, yes, we are going to introduce all this because we have agreed to these conditionalities from international organizations. Now, of course, there is a feeling that India's economic growth improved dramatically only because of the introduction of these reforms. Now, to a certain extent, it is true that the rate of growth has improved after these reforms were introduced, but there are a number of reasons for it. It's not that simple. But it has also got to be understood that the increase in the rate of growth started well before the reforms were introduced, as I said, in the 1980s, when the liberalization of the economy in a very subtle way started. At that time, the rate of growth began to increase. So it's not true to say, number one, that reforms started suddenly one fine morning, or as Professor Hegde said, radical transformation. No. Number two, it's also not true that improvement in the rate of growth started only after reforms were adopted. Actually, they started before that. And if you go into the literature, you will find that from the mid-1980s onwards, there was an increase in the rate of growth. Nothing very dramatic, but visible and quite impressive. So that's the second phase in our economic policy or state policy. First, reforms by stealth. First, interventionist. Secondly, some dilution. Then you had open adoption of reforms because of various reasons. And this went on. Now, today we have reached another phase. In the present phase, what we are witnessing is certain reforms being introduced, not that they're new, they were on the anvil for a long time, but we are actually introducing reforms without consultation, without discussion. And I give you 2 or 3 examples of that. One is the collection of 3 bills relating to the agricultural sector, which was rushed through. One main one against which all the Punjab and Haryana farmers are up in arms, and that is regarding farmers' markets, abolition of agricultural market committees, and all other things associated with that. And in fact, when I say this, I should acknowledge my very deep appreciation of the help given to me by my friend Professor Srijay Devarajas, who is he's listening to this lecture, but I had some very interesting discussions with him on this question. Now, this abolition of regulated markets, as we call them in Karnataka, is again not something drastic and new. It was there on the anvil for a long time, but it was done almost, I would say, with dramatic speed. It was done during the pandemic. Now, I think one of the reasons for that is perhaps that if you do that when there is some other crisis in society, you are less likely to have opposition to this. When you have opposition now, but the kind of opposition which you might have had in the absence of a pandemic, we don't know what that would have been. It's hard to say. But so that is one example. Actually, and the Essential Commodities Act, which has been modified. Then, of course, the laws, rules, and regulations relating to trade unions. That again has been done without any consultations with the participating parties, rather with the parties which are directly involved in trade union activities. But that also was rushed through Parliament. There was a lot of criticisms about the way it was done, but it has happened. So what we are witnessing today is a reform process under pressure. We are introducing reforms under the pressure seemingly of the pandemic, but not all of them are related to the pandemic. They are really, in my opinion, related to the general economic crisis. I think it would be wrong to say they are amending the farmers' legislation because of the pandemic. They are amending the laws regarding trade unions because of the pandemic. I mean, that doesn't make sense. Some time that these innovations, I won't call them innovations, that these reforms have been introduced. Now, we also have to understand that the new ones which have been introduced now, these new reforms, these have actually been, as I said earlier, on the anvil for a long time. The controversy about regulated markets has been there for a very long time. It's not as if it started yesterday. But today the situation is ripe because you are not likely to get that kind of opposition which you would have got earlier. And that is because of the preoccupation with the pandemic. People are more concerned about how to avoid the pandemic. State governments are also concerned about how to keep the fatality rate low, how to reduce it, and then now, of course, how to distribute the vaccine if and ever when it gets ready. They're saying it's going to be ready in 2 months, 3 months. Very amusingly, some time ago, somebody had said it has to be ready by the 15th of August. I mean, 15th of August is important for us as Independence Day, but the virus does not know that it's Independence Day. I don't think we can go to the virus and say, by the way, we have to celebrate our Independence Day. Please get away from our country. This is not going to work. I mean, I'm addressing a series of natural scientists here. But anyway, that the jokes apart. The kind of opposition, there is opposition now, certainly in Punjab and Haryana, particularly in Punjab, train services were suspended for 2 months. Only now they have started again. But really, the kind of opposition which you're now getting is somewhat different from what you would have got under a different set of circumstances. This is one point which I would like to make. Now, take the social sector, education and health in particular. There are distinguished educationists here with far more experience than I've had. 2 former vice chancellors, 2, and one present vice chancellor, our Hali vice chancellor. Now you know the difficulties of it. Now I scanned through the new education policy. I think my friend Professor Hegde has read it in greater detail than I have done. What I found was that, at least as far as higher education is concerned, the most important component seems to have been glossed over, and that is the availability of teaching staff. To me, if you ask me, as a former teacher, I still belong to that caste of teachers. If you ask me, the most important problem with education in this country is the lack of adequate numbers of adequately skilled staff. I think that is the most important thing. I find particularly in the state of Karnataka, whenever a proposal is given for starting a new course or a new university or a new college, the first thing that the minister concerned will say is, we will give you 25 acres of land. Now, not 25, even 100 acres of land will not improve your standards if you do not have qualified staff. Take the music university, I'm willing to give the name. That music university, to this day, as I know, I'm open to correction, I don't think there's a single permanent staff member. I don't know if I'm right or wrong. It doesn't have.
So it's the case with the Folklore University near Haveri. Not a single regular faculty.
Folklore has some, Professor Hegde, I went to...
On the faculty, not a single regular faculty. They have people on deputation.
So they have nobody. Now I'm not blaming them. I don't know whose fault it is. But to me, the most important component of higher education, of any education really, is what in economics we used to call human capital, human resources, unless you have them. I remember when the Ambedkar School of Economics was inaugurated in Bangalore. That was about 2 years ago, I think, or 3 years ago. The minister made a statement, this is going to be like the London School of Economics, and we will give 100 acres of land. Now, the London School of Economics does not even have 5 acres of land because it is in one of the most crowded areas of London. You have to leave? Please.
Just to go to Bangalore.
That's all.
Chancellors always on ball.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So what I'm saying is that this excessive, I find that 2 kinds of ingredients of education are getting excessive emphasis. One is, of course, the physical component. more buildings, more roads, more. I agree, physical infrastructure is important. Certainly in the physical and natural sciences, laboratories are very important. But I think equally important is the person who mans the laboratories. You have to have the right kind of people who can run your labs. Otherwise, I was told of a story that J.B.S. Holiday once went to the Central College many years ago when he was still alive and asked somebody, what are your problems here in this laboratory? And he said, I don't have an electron microscope. He said, my dear man, you have not exhausted the uses of the simple microscope. Why are you asking for an electronic microscope? First exhaust this. Now, again, you see the excessive emphasis on physical infrastructure, like land and buildings and so on. And the second is excessive reliance on technology. Like today, we are saying that school children should learn online. Now, we don't know what the problems involved in this are. I have no experience of teaching at that level, but there must be a lot of problems involved in communicating online to young kids. And there must be a lot of problems even talking to postgraduate students through the medium, an online medium. I mean, all of you have this, are teachers even now. I would have found it very difficult indeed to communicate through an online system. I mean, there's nothing like sitting opposite a student and interacting with her. So there's excessive emphasis on technology. And that is why what we were discussing before the meeting officially started, and that is, we say, okay, we are going to start the colleges from tomorrow. And then you find that tomorrow is not possible. And you say, no, we do it from December 1st. Why? Because you are relying on technological solutions. We are relying on technological solutions to sociological problems. For example, why is it that attendance in schools is very poor? It is related to a number of sociological factors. And where do you assure electricity supply in India? Half the time electricity is in short supply. So how do you say you're going to have online teaching? So excessive emphasis on physical infrastructure and equally excessive emphasis on what we call technological solutions. All problems are sought to be solved through technological means, and I don't think that's going to work. Whereas the real important ingredient of education, in my view, is the teaching component. And unless you have proper teachers, you're really not going to succeed at all. This is one aspect. Then, of course, there is a question which is being debated for years and years and years, and that is, what about the medium of instruction? I joined this university in the year 1956. Possibly some people in the audience may not have been born at that time. I joined the first year honors class in 1956 in Maharajas College. There was no Gangotri in those days. I'm not a Gangotri product. I'm a Maharajas College product. Now what happened? From that day till now, we are discussing what should be the medium of instruction. We have not found any solution to it. We went on talking even at that time, we should teach through Kannada. We did not. Today also we are discussing the same thing. That's one aspect where there has been no change at all I'm not joking, from 1956 when I was a raw, callow undergraduate student to today when I am 20 years into my retirement, it's the same thing. A little bit of change here and there in the idiom may have taken place. It must be true of, I'm sure Professor Hegde would have gone through the same experience. He's the same age as myself. Yeah. So we have still not been able to find a solution to this basic problem. What should be the medium of instruction? Now we all say, why should people go to English medium schools? Now the maid servant working in your house, I'm deeply honored by the presence of our former Vice Chancellor, Professor Rangappa. And I'd like to felicitate him on making, Professor Rangappa, let me take the opportunity of felicitation. No, it's all right. I'd like to take the opportunity of felicitating you on the distinction you have recently received, being in the top selected 2% of scientists. It's a very proud moment for us. This is one, the medium of instruction. There is some reference to it in the education policy, but no, I don't think there is an extensive discussion of this.
Of what?
Medium of instruction.
No.
In other words, or at least put it this way, there is no definite statement on what it should be. It is still hanging fire, as I said, as it was in the 1960s when I was a young teacher, in 1970s when I joined Gangotri, in the year 1999 when I retired. The same thing has gone on. And these problems are not being attacked by our educational policy makers. I think that's terribly important. Now, the other one is, yes, why is it that people prefer English medium? Now, I don't think there's anything intrinsically superior about the English medium, but why do people go to English medium schools? My maid servant will send her child to an English medium school because she thinks that English medium is the route to freedom. It is the route for improvement. May not be true.
From 1956, when I was a raw Cairo undergraduate student, to today, when I'm 20 years into my retirement, it's the same thing. A little bit of change here and there indeed. It must be, I'm sure it is idea that what was an experience in the same age as myself. So we have still not been able to find a solution.
Okay. ನಾವು ಅನ್ಮೂಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಹೇಳಿ ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ. ನೀವು ಅನ್ಮೂಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬಿಡಿ ಯಾರು ಅನ್ಮೂಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ.
Can I proceed?
He said English medium is the
Is the route to freedom. That is freedom from misery. You know, my child has not been able to do well, but my employer's son and daughter are doing very well. I can they're going to English medium. See, I'm not saying that it is irrefutable logic. It is not irrefutable, but that is the impression they have. Why? Because our government or state-aided schools are not able to provide the right kind of education. This is the problem. It's not that we are enamored. I can openly give an example of the school in Manas Gangotri. It was doing very well until there was some needless interference.
Recently it has been reorganized.
No, that I'm talking about. I'm talking about what happened when it was rector as the vice chancellor. I opposed English medium in the school, and he was shocked. He turned to me and said, "VK, you of all people, what's going wrong?" I told him, "You start English medium tomorrow. There will be a demonstration outside your office, and we won't be there to help you."
No, people are more sentimental and emotional than being
So
practical.
I told him, I said, "No, but please
I was
don't
convinced of that.
don't start it." Huh? You remember that? He was shocked. So what I'm saying is, I mean, these are important issues which we have not been able to find a solution in 30, 40, 50, 60 years' time. You know. Then, as I said, there's a difference between private and public schools, private and state-aided schools. The state-aided schools are not able to compete. Why? Because they don't have, especially human resources. I'm not talking about your laboratory facilities and so on. I'm really talking about how many people do you have who can teach there. Ultimately, as parents, we send children to schools where teaching is properly done, not other things. And that's where most of our state schools really have hit rock bottom. So this is one problem. And that is why now, what do you find? I find from the newspapers something absolutely shocking, that guest lecturers in some universities have not been paid their salaries. Am I right? Only last week, I think I saw a report in the newspapers.
It's in the university or in government sector.
Well, whatever it is. College teachers are not being paid. How do you expect them to put any enthusiasm into their job? How do you expect them to enthuse the students? In turn, how do you expect the students to respond? I think this is one of the big problems which we have not confronted. And therefore, you find that the state's role has got absolutely diluted when you come to something like education, which we once thought was its exclusive responsibility, not privilege. We thought it was the duty of the state to look after education and health. In both they are failing. In education, certainly it's failing because of this. Take the health sector. It is obvious that this country was not prepared to face something like a pandemic because we don't have the resources for it. We concentrate on curative medicine. Our medical schools do not really insist, for example, on community and social medicine or preventive and social medicine because there's no money in it. That's why no student wants to say, no student wants to do an MS or MD, whatever you call it, in preventive and social medicine. No, because there's no consultancy in it. But that is the area which I think is most important for a country like India. If today you are not able to educate your population, your people, to wear a mask, part of it is because they have not been socially educated. You have not told them what happens, how it spreads across the community. And that's why, again, you find that within the sphere of medicine, our state sector has not done very well. One more point about the state sector I must mention. We went in for this lockdown, that 2-month lockdown period, which was very severe. None of us have seen anything like that in our lifetime. But really, what is the effect of this? One effect, of course, is that it is very dramatic. But did you pay any attention to migrant labor? You give them 4 hours notice and say, 6 o'clock this evening, everything is going to come to a standstill. Now, the interesting point, I shouldn't say interesting, that's the wrong word to use. The disturbing point is this. It's been made into a very good paper by 2 Indian economists, and that is this. You know, when you count fatalities, you look at fatalities which have come directly from COVID-19 or through COVID-19 plus comorbidities plus age. That's all. But what about things like starvation? Imagine somebody walking from here to Bihar with his or her family. It probably took him, I don't know, 1 week, 10 days. We don't know what happened to them on the way. What about the long-term implications of this? As these 2 authors, Devraj Ray and S. Subramanian, point out, starvation kills, but it kills slowly. It kills slowly. You don't die tomorrow because you have malnutrition. But over a period of time, you will find that it has affected your system. But that's something which we don't factor in at all. This is one. Now let me come to the last point. I just want to wind up so that if there are any questions, I can take them. This is, as I said, we just don't know how to estimate fatalities, morbidities, because we do it only through this direct method. How many people came to the hospital? How many, how many left dead? But I mean, there are all these other factors to be taken into consideration, which unfortunately we don't do. Because we have not trained our minds to look in that direction. I mean, this is the problem. Now, the next related point is this. Here, economics, medicine, education, all are connected. Now, we keep saying, why should you have all this distribution of rations? There is so much inefficiency in it. A lot of people who are not eligible for benefits use these benefits. Some people who are eligible are left out. Instead of that, why not give direct cash transfers? Just hand over the money to them. Now, I think this is a very serious problem. Number one, it has been seen in studies in several countries that when you give money to people, they don't squander it. The general upper middle class and middle class attitude is, oh, no, don't give money to these people. They simply drink it off. It's not true. Studies have proved that when you make direct cash transfers, people do use it quite responsibly. They use it on education, they use it to improve their nutrition, etc. But I have a different problem with this. My problem is this. If you make direct cash transfers instead of, say, your public distribution system, what happens is this. Many people wrongly avail themselves of the benefit. We know that. I am not entitled to it, but I go and buy ragi or whatever it is. I mean, obviously it's waste. But this is called an error of inclusion. But there is another thing called error of exclusion, which is even more dangerous. Error of exclusion is, I am excluded because I don't have a particular Aadhaar card. You say, no, your Aadhaar card was issued in Chamarajanagar, it is not valid in down there. Or it was valid in Hassan, it's not valid in Jammu and Kashmir. I'm walking 300 kilometers to reach my home and I can't access food. So you get errors of exclusion. Now, an error of exclusion is much more serious than an error of inclusion for this reason. An error of exclusion means that an entire family will be deprived of basic food and nutrition, maybe for months. We don't know, and there's no calculation. Who calculates? How many of us go and calculate? We have estimates, but they're only rough estimates. So this error of exclusion is a very serious fault. And this is something which will plague you if you have direct transfers. And that's why when people say we'll have a universal basic income, I think these are things which have to be dealt with extreme care. In my view, it's better not to go into it at this point of time. Now, one final point is this. What we are now doing is not to pay attention to facts like this, errors of inclusion, errors of exclusion. Because somebody said universal basic income, yes, everybody talks about universal basic income. Now, instead of that, I think this is the number one, this pandemic is the time when you should not make fundamental decisions. You know, in the background of a crisis, you should not make fundamental decisions. Because these fundamental decisions are going to affect not just one generation, but maybe several generations. First, deal with the pandemic, and then slowly apply your mind to things like this, to direct transfers or errors of inclusion or whatever. We don't do that. I mean, look at the hurry in which these, I will give you these examples. So these 4 bills which are rushed through Parliament. And on very flimsy grounds, the opposition was stifled. Now, I think that is a very wrong thing to do. The same thing applies to education, about which Professor Hegde has been writing every now and then in the newspapers. But I mean, this is an area which requires very serious thought. And that serious thought, most unfortunately, does not seem to have been given. And that is why we are still talking in terms of how much money we spend on education. That's not really the issue. So I think I'm going to stop now. And if there are any questions or if there is any interaction, I'd be quite happy to deal with them to the extent that I can. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Now it is open for discussion, sir. Any clarification, suggestions, not questions, sir.
Even questions.
You can question also.
Even questions.
With the permission of the speaker, you can question
I
also.
have no objection. I may not be able to answer, but
Some suggestions, some.
You don't have to necessarily answer. You can respond.
Yeah.
good distinction.
Sir, Professor Rangnath, sir.
Yes, Rangnath.
ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅವ್ರು ಹೇಳೋದು ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ
ಅನ್ಮ್ಯೂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ
ಸರ್ ಅನ್ಮ್ಯೂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಸರ್
ಮ್ಯೂಟ್ ಆಗಿ ಅವ್ರು ಕಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು
Thank you very much, sir, for giving this talk. And more than Raghunath, there are Sir Gidesh sir is there, and I want his reaction to this lecture. Gidesh sir.
Huh?
Gidesh should react for your lecture.
No, Hegde can do it in the end.
After that, he will react.
No, the Raghunath.
Yes, sir.
Hegde can do it in the end. He is an active participant.
Gidesh sir will do it at the end.
So I meant it seriously. What do you think?
Sir, I agree with you, but the problem now we are confronted with is, as you said, we should not take any decision in haste when we are under pressure. Because the way in which we react under pressure is different from the way in which we react under normal circumstances. But over the years, over the years, such things have been repeatedly happening, not only in our country, across the globe. People use the weak movements to see that some of the reforms are pushed in. And same thing is happening here also. And because of pandemic, even though you want to react and respond, it is not possible. Similarly, many things happened during emergency. There was another type of pressure and many things were pushed at that time. As you said, whatever we do in haste, under pressure, etc., it has effect on generations, not only immediate effect, but also it must have effect on a couple of generations to follow it up. So same thing is happening. The second thing is that what you said was clearly right. I can't say right. It really, we are trying to have technological solutions to sociological problems. And always we say industrial revolution have changed the way in which we live. Today, we repeatedly we say the society has been transformed for technological inputs now. Because technological inputs in terms of artificial intelligence, machine learning, machine economy, many things are coming up now. The way in which we teach, the way in which we train our students, how the universities will react to this transforming period is a real challenge. So, to my perception, as you said, the human resources, the human capital is the most important gap in our academic structure. All commissions, all reports, everybody has said, including the new education policies also pointed out. Time and again, they have said in the country, we have about 70,000 vacancies across the state, across the country. Unless
In higher education, 70,000.
There are 90,000
70,000 including state and central. Everybody is interested to fill up those vacancies. But as you said,
90,000 single teacher.
as you said, sir, we have started across the country over the decades. Over the decades, many new courses have been born, many new universities have been created, and most of these things are politically correct decisions, but academically devastating decisions. But last 25 years that has happened. About 25 years that has happened, and many years time have said most of these new programs, new courses, new universities, new institutions are born with congenital defects. If the child is born with congenital defects, it's not curable.
Because they are ill-conceived.
Yeah, that's what I'm telling you, sir. That's what I'm telling you.
Both
Irrespective of the
biologically
government.
and ideologically.
Morally.
Both, yeah.
Irrespective of the government in power, these things have happened in the last 2.5 decades. And we are also party to that. We have passed these courses, we have passed these new programs, etc., in all the statutory bodies. And most of these
Lady,
most of these courses, what we have started without human resource, etc., is market-oriented courses. Market-oriented courses, and the students, what we have trained, they're not skilled enough to be appointed. That's why many a times Biocon chief, Madam Shah, has said, henceforth, we will not appoint any biotechnology graduates from universities. And she has created her own biotechnology academy, Biocon Academy now. And finishing school she has started. So graduates whom we train for 3 years or 5 years, she will get them, they get into the Biocon Academy and then go through that. So what I'm trying to tell you, sir, human resources, human capital is the one that has to be addressed first to make sure any education policy will be successful. That has to be addressed, and people are trying to address it. But now, right away, if you want to appoint people, there are no faculty members, qualified, skilled, dedicated faculty members.
Thank you.
So this is a challenge, sir. Unless we address this, no education policy could be successful. For example, in our own zoology department, we were 18 faculty members. Today, it is reduced to 3.
You are lucky.
Like that.
I told that department with only one teacher.
Yes, sir.
Am I right?
One department, several departments.
Nearly.
Not only one department.
Shunya.
No, at least,
Yeah.
which is one teacher.
Across the country, it has happened, sir.
It is good. It is good.
But for that, government is telling that they are appointed 8,000, 9,000 guest lecturers to teach. That
Sir,
is the alternate
recent-
arrangement they made.
But Professor Niranjan, there are more guests than lecturers. I have seen.
You know, government is thinking that.
You have to treat them gently. Because
What can you do? It's not their fault.
Last,
It's not their fault.
Sir, last point, sir. Recently, our former DG of CSR gave a lecture in the INSA Academy. He said, because of all these things, there is one thing that is happening to the institution. One endangered phenotype, one endangered parameter is getting. That endangered factor is the teachers. Teachers will lose jobs. Teachers cannot be appointed. It is an endangered category. Is a fame. That's really true. Vacancies are available. We don't have qualified people to be appointed. So how to overcome this is the challenge. We have then only education can be improved, followed by the economy of the country. As long as this human capital is not addressed by policymakers from the center to the state, no other capital can be improved. Now, just now, you have congratulated Professor Rangappa sir. Unless the tradition, what he has built up is sustained in chemistry department, it will vanish. How to sustain it? Rashekar Shetty has built a department, how to sustain it? Sustainability is absent in most of the cases. When Professor Hegde went to DST 30 years back, he was telling me there were no projects funded by DST at any one of the universities. Then with the pigeon milk, it was his first project. And he went for presentation, he was surprised to see no other department in the state has projects funded by DST. But from zero there, it went on and on and on, and we grew for the 20 years, and now it is the lowest step. And this is happening because human capital is affected on campuses. Unless it is recovered, rejuvenated, I am not sure what will happen to our next generation of students. So we have used an excellent expression, sir. Human capital, human resource, that is the economy of the country. Thank you, Nataraj.
Thank you, Rangnath.
sir, Siddhagowda sir, is there anything?
Very nice talk from weekend, no doubt. But my apprehension is that who should bell the cat? We have been talking from last more than 2 decades.
You
have to bell the cat. You are in the race now.
not everybody, you.
You are sitting in race now. You have to bell the cat. Nobody.
All of you.
We don't have power.
In race now.
You have power. We don't have power.
You have superpower.